The light along the Conemaugh River had a particular stillness to it on the morning of May 31st, 1889, the kind of stillness that precedes upheaval, a stillness where the only sound was the murmur of water over stones and the occasional creak of wooden porches in the breeze. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, that Friday morning began the way most mornings began, a town waking to the smell of coal smoke and damp earth, steel workers rising before the sun, church bells ringing across rooftops already slick with rain. But high above the valley, 14 miles upstream, something darker was stirring. The South Fork Dam, an earthen wall holding back a lake the size of heaven itself, was groaning under the weight of 10 inches of rain that had fallen in the last 24 hours. And by the time the morning sun tried to break through the storm clouds, it was already too late. Johnstown had not always lived under the shadow of water. Once, before tragedy wrote its name across the valley 3 times, it had been a city of prosperity and pride, a place where men laid brick and steel with their own hands and built something that felt like permanence. The town sat nestled between mountains, a crook in the river where geography made commerce inevitable. By the 1880s, Johnstown hummed with industry. The Cambria Iron Company glowed orange through the nights. The Pennsylvania Railroad carried freight and fortune through the valley, and downtown streets were lined with shops selling dry goods, hats, candy, and dreams. Families lived in tidy rows of brick and wood homes. Children played stickball in dirt alleys. Women hung laundry on lines that swayed between buildings. On Sunday mornings, the valley echoed with hymns sung in German, English, and Welsh. The steel mills ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, both to keep up with demand and to keep the furnaces going. If they were allowed to go cold, it took days for them to get hot enough again to melt iron ore. By 1890, Johnstown's population had increased to over 30,000, drawn by the promise of steady work and a future made of iron. Johnstown was not a grand city, but it was a good one. It was home. In the 1870s, it had the highest steel production in the nation, a technological leader in an industry that was forging America itself. The blast furnaces, steelworks, and rolling mills of the Cambria Iron Company stretched for miles along the river flat, where the valley of the Conemaugh expanded just enough to make room for ambition. Immigrants came from southern and eastern Europe, from Wales and Germany, and they settled next to the mill in the area still known as Cambria City. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the heat and noise, poured molten iron into molds, hammered rails that would carry trains across the continent. They built churches with steeples that pierced the smoke, opened bakeries that smelled of yeast and sugar, raised children who spoke 3 languages and believed in the promise of tomorrow. Above the valley on the wooded hills of the Allegheny Highlands, another kind of life flourished. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had purchased the old Western Reservoir in 1879 and renamed it Lake Conemaugh. It was a grand retreat for Pittsburgh's wealthiest men, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon, a place where they could escape the grime of the city and spend summer days sailing, fishing, and dining in a 47-room clubhouse that overlooked the water. The lake was magnificent, 5 miles around, 75 feet deep in places, held back by a dam of packed earth and clay that stretched 900 feet across the valley and rose 72 feet high. The club members loved the lake. They stocked it with expensive game fish, hosted annual regattas, and took photographs of their children playing along the shore. It was paradise for them, but the dam was old. It had been built in 1852 to supply water for a canal system that became obsolete almost immediately. It had broken once before, in 1862, though that rupture caused little harm because the reservoir was only half full. The dam had passed through several owners, each one neglecting it a little more than the last. One owner even removed the 5 drainage pipes beneath the structure and sold them for scrap, which meant there was no way to drain the lake for repairs. When the South Fork Club took possession, they made modifications that seemed harmless at the time. They lowered the top of the dam by a few feet so 2 carriages could pass side by side, and they installed fish screens across the spillway to keep their expensive bass and trout from escaping. Engineers had warned them. Local residents downstream had expressed concern. But the club members dismissed the fears. They were men of industry, men who built empires. Surely they understood dams. No one thought much about what might happen if the rains came hard and the spillway could not drain fast enough. On the night of May 30th, the rain began in earnest. It fell without pause through the darkness, drumming on rooftops and turning roads into streams. By dawn on May 31st, the lake behind the South Fork Dam had swollen beyond its banks. Club employees scrambled to clear debris from the spillway screens, but it was no use. The water was rising too fast. By mid-morning, the dam began to sag in the center. By early afternoon, it was leaking in places, muddy water seeping through cracks in the earthwork. Horses were brought in to pull plows across the top of the dam in a desperate attempt to create channels for the water to escape. Men dug with shovels until their hands bled. And then, at 3:10 in the afternoon, the center gave way. What followed was not a flood in the ordinary sense. It was an unleashing. 14 million cubic meters of water, 20 million tons, burst through the breach and roared down the narrow valley at speeds approaching 40 miles per hour. It did not look like water. Witnesses described it as a moving hillside. A towering black wall 40 feet high, filled with trees, boulders, railroad cars, entire houses, livestock, and human beings. The sound was like a freight train multiplied by thunder. It was, some thought, the end of the world. The wave reached Johnstown in 10 minutes. It struck the center of town at the Pennsylvania Railroad stone bridge, a massive arched structure that spanned the Conemaugh River. The bridge held, but the debris did not pass through. Houses, boxcars, steel rails, trees, barbed wire from the ironworks, and bodies piled up against the bridge's arches, forming a dam of wreckage 30 acres wide and 70 feet high. The water, unable to pass, surged backward up the Stony Creek River, creating a second wave that struck Johnstown from a different direction. Then gravity pulled the surge back to the bridge and the debris caught fire. No one knows exactly how, perhaps from overturned stoves or lanterns, and the pile burned for 3 days. At least 80 people trapped in the wreckage burned to death while the floodwaters receded around them. By nightfall, Johnstown was silent. The waters had withdrawn, leaving behind a landscape of mud, splintered wood, and death. Bodies were found tangled in wire, crushed beneath beams, lying in streets that no longer existed. Some were pulled from the river weeks later. Some were found as far away as Cincinnati. Some were never found at all. The final count was 2,208 people dead, though for years it was listed as 2,209, until a man named Leroy Temple, presumed dead, walked back into town 11 years later and revealed he had survived. 99 entire families were erased. 396 children died. 124 women were widowed. 198 men lost their wives. 98 children were orphaned. 777 bodies were never identified. They were buried together in a corner of Grandview Cemetery, under stones that read only "unknown." In the days that followed, the nation turned its eyes toward Johnstown. Clara Barton arrived with the American Red Cross and 50 volunteers. Relief poured in from across the United States and from 18 foreign countries. Journalists descended on the valley and filled newspapers with stories of heroism and horror. And slowly, as the shock began to fade, the question formed, who was responsible? Everyone knew the answer. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club had owned the dam. They had modified it, lowered it, removed its drainage pipes, installed fish screens that blocked the spillway. They had ignored warnings. They had been negligent. But proving negligence in a court of law was another matter entirely. The club members were the most powerful men in Pennsylvania, perhaps in the nation. They owned steel mills, railroads, banks. They had lawyers who could argue that the flood was an act of God, a disaster no human could have foreseen or prevented. And that is exactly what they did. The American Society of Civil Engineers was tasked with investigating the disaster. It took them 7 months to complete their report, and when it was finally published in 1891, it largely absolved the club. The report admitted that certain modifications had been made to the dam, but concluded that even a perfectly maintained dam would have failed under such extraordinary rainfall. The club members expressed sympathy for the victims. Some made charitable donations, but not one of them admitted fault. Not one of them paid a single dollar in damages. The lawsuits filed by survivors and families of the dead were dismissed or settled for pennies. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club quietly dissolved a few years later, and its members returned to their lives of wealth and comfort. The lake drained away, the clubhouse fell into ruin, and Johnstown was left to bury its dead and rebuild on ground still soaked with grief. But rebuild they did. Within months, the debris was cleared. Within a year, new homes and businesses had risen from the mud. The steel mills, which had suffered comparatively little damage, resumed production. The Cambria Iron Company reorganized and expanded, building a new, modern steel mill in Franklin Borough, east of Johnstown. By 1898, it had become the Cambria Steel Company, and it continued to grow. The population climbed. The trains kept running. The furnaces kept burning. Johnstown proved to the world that it could not be broken by water, that its people were tougher than the rivers that hemmed them in. They believed, with a kind of stubborn faith, that the worst was behind them. They were wrong. On March 17, 1936, the rivers rose again. This time it was not the failure of a dam, but the relentless accumulation of rain and snowmelt, over a foot of precipitation in less than a week. The Conemaugh and Stony Creek swelled beyond their banks, and once more Johnstown was underwater. The flood reached heights of nearly 25 feet in some parts of the city. About 24 people died. 77 buildings were destroyed. Nearly 3,000 more were severely damaged. Property damages were estimated at $41 million. The people of Johnstown rebuilt again. They reinforced the riverbanks. They raised buildings. They constructed a channel to divert floodwaters. They told themselves that this time, they had learned the lesson. They had tamed the water. The city continued to thrive through the 1940s and 1950s, its population swelling to over 67,000 in the 1920 census and remaining relatively stable for 3 decades. The steel mills ran day and night. Bethlehem Steel, one of eastern Pennsylvania's largest steel companies, bought Cambria Iron and Steel in 1923, and by the early 1970s, over 11,000 people worked for Bethlehem Steel in Johnstown. The mills filled the Conemaugh Valley for miles. Blast furnaces glowed against the night sky. Rail cars clanked through the yards. The city had everything it needed: jobs, schools, churches, theaters, neighborhoods where children could ride bikes until dark, and mothers called them home for dinner. Johnstown was alive, and then came July 19th, 1977. The rain started in the afternoon and did not stop. By evening it was falling in sheets. By midnight it was a deluge. In less than 12 hours, over 12 inches of rain fell on the mountains surrounding Johnstown. The ground could not absorb it, the rivers could not carry it, and the dams, small dams, earthen dams, dams built decades earlier to create reservoirs and recreation lakes, could not hold it. One by one, they failed. The Laurel Run Dam broke first at 2:45 in the morning on July 20th. The wall of water that cascaded down the narrow valley sounded like a roaring freight train. It acted like a giant bulldozer, sweeping and flattening everything in its path. Houses were ripped from their foundations and smashed. Cars, trucks, trees, boulders were tossed around like toys. The wave slammed into the community of Tanneryville in West Taylor Township with such force that 39 people lost their lives in minutes. Several families were wiped out entirely. The devastation was surreal and incomprehensible. The flood wave continued downstream, slammed into an already raging and swollen Conemaugh River, and split. It had a backwashing effect that inundated downtown Johnstown. It also sent a killer wave downstream that destroyed the Hoover Trailer Park in Seward, killing almost a dozen more people. 5 other dams failed that night. Together, they poured more than 128 million gallons of water into the Conemaugh Valley. In comparison, approximately 4.8 billion gallons were unleashed when the South Fork Dam burst in 1889. But this time, the valley was more developed, more densely populated, and the water hit neighborhoods and trailer parks where people were asleep in their beds. 85 people died. 8 victims were never found. Thousands of homes were damaged or destroyed. Downtown Johnstown was submerged under 6 feet of water. The flood left behind mud, wreckage, and a crushing sense of déjà vu. How could this happen again? How could the same place, the same rivers, the same mountains betray them 3 times? The list of the dead was long and heartbreaking. In Tanneryville, families huddled in their homes as the water rose, and then the walls gave way. Chad Allen Gadula, age 6, and his mother Kathleen, age 23, died in Dunlow. Harry and Lula Teeter, married for decades, died together in Mineral Point. Greg Allen Dixon, age 9, died in Seward. Entire neighborhoods mourned together because everyone had lost someone, a neighbor, a cousin, a friend from church. The funerals went on for weeks. A monument was erected in Central Park. To remember the victims, a boulder rolled downhill by the floodwaters when the Laurel Run Dam broke. There is also a plaque at the West Taylor Volunteer Fire Company on Cooper Avenue in Tanneryville to commemorate the 39 people who lost their lives that fateful morning. The plaque is attached to that same boulder, a piece of the mountain itself turned into a gravestone. And once again, Johnstown rebuilt. Volunteers came from across the country. The Army National Guard cleared debris. Insurance adjusters tallied the losses. Families salvaged what they could. Photographs, wedding rings, a child's toy pulled from the mud. They gutted their homes down to the studs, ripped out drywall and insulation that would never dry, and started over. They told themselves that this was the last time, that the city had suffered enough, that surely God would not allow it to happen again. But even as they rebuilt, something else was breaking. The steel industry, which had sustained Johnstown for more than a century, was dying. The 1970s hit the city hard. The loss of steel jobs was the most severe the region had ever seen. In 1977, the same year as the flood, what became known as Black Monday saw 5,000 jobs lost from Youngstown Sheet and Tube alone in nearby Youngstown, Ohio, a harbinger of what was coming for Johnstown. By the early 1990s, Bethlehem Steel, which had employed over 11,000 people in Johnstown in the early 1970s, had shuttered most of its operations. The blast furnaces went cold. The rail yards fell silent. The mill buildings, which had once glowed with molten steel and the promise of a paycheck, stood empty and rusting. When the steel died, Johnstown died with it. There was no other industry to replace it. Coal production in Pennsylvania was cratering in the latter half of the 20th century. The railroad, once a lifeline, no longer needed a hub in Johnstown. Young people left for college and never came back. Families moved to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to places where work could still be found. The population, which had peaked at over 67,000 in the 1920s and remained relatively stable through the 1960s, began to collapse. By 2020, the population had fallen to just over 18,000, a quarter of its peak. Today, on a Saturday afternoon in July, with the weather 75 degrees and sunny, downtown Johnstown is nearly empty. The streets are lined with abandoned buildings. The storefronts are dark. There are over 500 abandoned properties in the city, and in Johnstown and Cambria County combined, there are 4,600 abandoned properties. 1,800 of them need to be demolished. But there is no money to tear them down, and no one to buy the land if they did. The ones who stayed are mostly older now. They remember when the streets were crowded, when the mills ran 3 shifts and you could hear the clang of steel from your front porch. They remember when every store was full, when the movie theaters had lines on Friday nights, when high school football games drew crowds that spilled out of the bleachers. They remember the floods, too. Some of them lived through all 3. They can point to the high water marks on buildings, tell you where the bodies were found, recite the names of the dead like a prayer. They stayed because this is home, because their parents are buried here, because they cannot imagine living anywhere else, even if everywhere else might be easier. There is a man in Cambria City who still walks to the corner store every morning for coffee, even though the store is boarded up now, and he has to drive 3 miles to find one that is open. There is a woman in Tanneryville who plants flowers every spring in the yard where her house once stood before the 1977 flood swept it away. She rebuilt on the same spot, and she will not leave, no matter how many times the river threatens. These are the keepers of memory, the ones who refuse to let Johnstown be forgotten, even as the rest of the world drives past on the highway and never stops. The flood museums still stand. The Johnstown Flood Museum tells the story of 1889, with photographs of the wreckage and artifacts pulled from the mud. The Johnstown Heritage Discovery Center tells the story of the steel industry, of the immigrants who came and the lives they built. Tourists come sometimes to see where history happened. They walk through the exhibits, shake their heads at the tragedy, take photographs of the stone bridge that still stands where the debris piled up in 1889, and then they leave. They drive back to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or wherever they came from, and Johnstown returns to its silence. Nature is reclaiming what is left. Vines grow through the windows of abandoned row houses. Weeds push up through the asphalt of parking lots that no one uses. Deer wander through neighborhoods where children used to play. The old mill buildings along the river are slowly collapsing, their steel beams rusting into lace, their roofs caving in under the weight of snow and time. There is something almost beautiful about it. The way the earth takes back what was once taken from it. The way green creeps over gray. The way silence fills the spaces where noise once lived. On certain mornings, when the light is right and the mist rises from the river, you can almost see them, the ghost of the city that was. The steelworkers heading to the morning shift, lunch pails in hand, the children running to school, their laughter echoing off brick walls. The women hanging laundry, the white sheets snapping in the breeze. The men gathered outside the corner bar, talking about the Pirates game, or the union contract, or the weather. You can almost hear the furnaces roaring, the trains whistling, the church bells ringing across the valley. You can almost smell the bread baking, the coal burning, the river after rain. But then the light shifts, and the ghosts fade, and all that remains is the empty street, the boarded windows, the silence. Johnstown is a city that refused to die, even when death came 3 times in the form of water. But it is also a city that could not survive the slow erosion of industry and hope. The floods took lives, but the loss of steel took futures, and now Johnstown exists in a kind of limbo, neither fully alive nor fully gone, a monument to what happens when progress moves on and leaves a place behind. There are those who talk about revival, about bringing new industry to the valley, about turning the abandoned buildings into lofts and art galleries, about attracting remote workers who can live anywhere and might choose Johnstown for its low cost of living and its history. There are grants and initiatives and plans, but plans do not fill the streets. They do not bring back the children who left. They do not undo the floods or the factory closures or the decades of decline. And so Johnstown waits, quiet and patient, holding its breath. The rivers still flow through the valley, indifferent as always. The Conemaugh and the Stony Creek meet at the same spot where they have always met, where they will always meet, and the water moves on toward the Ohio River, and eventually the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico. The water does not remember the people it killed or the city it destroyed 3 times. The water does not care. It simply flows as it has for millennia, as it will for millennia more, long after the last building has fallen and the last street has disappeared under grass and the name Johnstown has been forgotten. But the people remember. The survivors of the 1889 flood told their stories to their children, and those children told their children, and now the stories are written in books, and displayed in museums and preserved in oral histories recorded by Boy Scouts working on Eagle Scout projects. The survivors of the 1936 flood did the same, and the survivors of the 1977 flood are still here, still telling their stories to anyone who will listen. They remember the sound of the water coming, the cold and the darkness, the way the world ended and then somehow continued. They remember the names of the dead. They remember what was lost, and perhaps that is what remains when the noise fades. Not the buildings or the steel or the industry, but the memory. The knowledge that people lived here, loved here, suffered here, and refused to give up even when the odds were insurmountable. That they rebuilt 3 times, not because it was easy or even wise, but because this was home and home is worth fighting for, even when home keeps trying to kill you. That they stayed when everyone else left, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because leaving would mean admitting defeat. And they were not ready to admit defeat. Johnstown, Pennsylvania, a city destroyed 3 times by water. A city that refused to die but could not quite figure out how to live. A city that once forged the rails that built America, and now sits rusting in the valley, waiting for something, a miracle, a flood, a future, an end. The light along the Conemaugh River is still and quiet now, the way it was on that morning in 1889 before everything changed. The water flows. The wind moves through empty streets, and somewhere, in the silence, you can still hear the echo of hammers on steel, of children laughing, of church bells ringing, of a city that was.